Thank you so much. My name is Abayomi Azikiwe, and I'm from the Detroit and Michigan branch of Workers' World Party. It's an honor for me to speak once again here at the annual Workers' World Party National Conference, particularly with this year's event being held in the sister city of Detroit, and that is Newark, New Jersey. I want to thank Brother Larry Ham for welcoming us this morning. Detroit and Newark are sister cities. In Detroit, we have been commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Detroit Rebellion of 1967. The rebellion in Newark began on July 12th and 13th. In Detroit, we were just 9 days later, on July 23rd, of course, Detroit being the largest urban rebellion in the history of the United States up until that time period. And this afternoon, I'd like to speak to you briefly on the topic of socialist methodology and the mass struggle, some of the lessons that we've learned in the city of Detroit and in the state of Michigan. Now, this year represents the centenary of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, which was a monumental, cataclysmic, socially transformative occurrence, which served as a political model for all peoples seeking to liberate themselves from capitalism and imperialism. As a group, we are principally concerned with building a revolutionary political party of the working class and the nationally oppressed. And in doing that, we need to study both the ideological and organizational contributions of V.I. Lenin. First and foremost, it is necessary to adopt a dialectical materialist approach to the struggle against exploitation and oppression. It is imperative to understand the nature of the enemy in which we are seeking to defeat and overcome. Ultimately, the destruction of the world capitalist system is a prerequisite to the genuine emancipation of humanity. Socialism leading to a communist society provides the only hope for the realization of world peace, security, and sustainability. Nonetheless, the freedom of the proletariat and the oppressed nations will not be achieved spontaneously. Perhaps the most profound lessons of the Bolshevik Party is the emphasis placed upon scientific organization based upon the principles of democratic centralism. These axioms are relevant today, just as relevant today as they were over a century ago during the early 20th century, when Lenin published his groundbreaking work entitled What Is to Be Done in 1903. During this time period of industrial capitalism's rise, it was rapidly consolidating the exploitative productive processes, which were later labeled as Taylorism or Fordism. This witnessed the emergence of the assembly line, mechanized agriculture, the rapacious mining of strategic minerals, oil drilling, international trade and shipping, along with the consolidation of finance and banking as the dominant economic force within global capitalism, which Lenin defined in 1916 during World War I, imperialism being the highest stage of capitalism. This shaped the character of the system in which we continue to struggle against in a contemporary epoch. In What Is to Be Done, Lenin poses a challenge to the socialist movement, saying, quote, "We must now deal with the question that has undoubtedly come to the mind of every reader. Can a connection be established between primitiveness as growing pains that affect the whole movement and economism, which is one of the currents in the Russian social democratic movement?" Lenin continues saying, "We think that it can. Lack of practical training, of ability to carry on organizational work is certainly common to all of us, including those who have from the very outset unswervingly stood for revolutionary Marxism. Of course, were it only the lack of practical training, no one could blame the practical workers, but the term primitiveness embraces something more like of good training. It denotes a narrow scope of revolutionary work generally. Failure to understand that a good organization of revolutionaries cannot be built on the basis of such narrow activity. And lastly, and this is the main thing according to Lenin, attempts to justify this narrowness and to elevate it to a, quote, special theory, unquote, i.e. subservience to spontaneity on this question too. Once such attempts were revealed, it became clear that the primitiveness is connected with economism, and that we shall never rid ourselves of this narrowness of our organizational activity until we rid ourselves of economism generally, i.e. the narrow conception of Marxist theory, as well as the role and direction of our movement. Lenin goes on to say, some began to say that the working masses themselves have not yet advanced to broad and militant political tasks, which the revolutionaries are attempting to impose on them, that they must continue to struggle for immediate political demands, to conduct the economic struggle which is, quote, accessible to the mass movement. There must be an organization that will say that it is possible and necessary to bring about a political revolution. But this does not require building a strong organization of revolutionaries to train the proletariat in steadfast and stubborn struggle. All we need to do is to snatch up our old friend, the accessible cudgel. To drop metaphor, it means that we must organize a general strike, or that we must stimulate the spiritless progress of the working class movement by means of excited terror. Both these trends, the opportunist trend and the so-called revolutionist trend, bow to the prevailing amateurism. Neither believes that it can be eliminated. Neither understands our primary and imperative practical task, and that is to establish an organization of revolutionaries capable of lending energy, stability, and continuity to the political struggle, unquote. Now, our work during this recent period in the city of Detroit as revolutionaries, we have no other choice than to respond to the continuing crises generated by the contradictions within the world capitalist system. Detroit, having been the material birthplace of industrial capitalism, in its most advanced form, provides tremendous insights into the transformation of the exploitative system over the last decade and a half. In the fall of 2002, the Michigan Emergency Committee Against War and Injustice, MCOWI, was formed just 5 months prior to the United States-led massive bombing, invasion, and occupation of the Middle Eastern state of Iraq. Just 16 months prior to the second intervention in Iraq, Afghanistan was targeted for occupation, a war which continues to this day, more than 16 years later. From the outset, MCOWI adopted the slogan, "Money for our cities, not for war." This captured the direct link between the Pentagon budget and the burgeoning impoverishment of the urban areas throughout the United States. Another distinguishing feature of MCOWI's program was that the organization was not only anti-interventionist, but anti-imperialist. Because there is a distinction between being anti-interventionist and being anti-imperialist. Our struggle against imperialism is informed by the unconditional support for the right of self-determination and the national liberation of all oppressed peoples. One of the greatest achievements of MCOWI has been the founding and institutionalization of the annual Detroit Dr. Martin Luther King Day Rally and March. Here, we set out to reclaim the actual social justice and anti-war legacy of MLK. We reject the false and distorted history of the civil rights movement by emphasizing its progressive contributions to the struggle against racism and economic exploitation, through emphasizing the merger with the struggle for Black power, Black liberation, and solidarity with the national liberation movements. January 15th, 2018 will mark our 15th year of organizing Martin Luther King Day in Detroit. This manifestation has resulted in an effective alliance with the principled and honest veterans of the civil rights and black power movements of the 1950s to the 1970s. Moreover, subsequent generations of activists and youth in the labor movement, in the student sector, the community organizers and activists, and the leftists are brought together annually to celebrate the gains of the struggle, as well as being inspired by the possibilities of future advances in the struggle. The Moratorium Now Coalition to stop foreclosures, evictions, and utility shutoffs grew right out of the work of Macaulay. It is not enough for revolutionaries to only focus on what may be considered anti-imperialist work. In a municipality such as Detroit, with its 82% African American population, which has been systematically impacted by the ravages of national oppression and super-exploitation, this constitutes an integral demographic within the oppressed African nation in the U.S. empire. Having gone from being the center of the African American working class politics, social activity, and national culture to a city which illustrates clearly the declining system of capitalism requires consistent intervention by the Leninist Party within the mass struggle. This is why we have continued for more than a decade now to organize around the housing crisis. We demanded a moratorium on all foreclosures and evictions. For us, housing is a fundamental human right for working people. We reject the notion that only certain people are deserving of quality housing, of quality education, of water, of utility services, along with environmental sustainability. All oppressed people must be free from police terrorism and the overall tyranny of the racist capitalist state. Our work on housing led us to defend the municipal retirees during 2013 and 2014 from the pseudo-legalized theft of pensions and health care benefits. We struggled against the privatization of public resources and the erosion of bourgeois democratic rights. These rights gained through decades of civil rights and labor struggles are the property of the working class and the oppressed. Bourgeois democratic rights are being reversed as a byproduct of the crisis of capitalism and imperialism. The war machine and the criminal policies of the financial institutions are two sides of the same vicious system designed to disempower the masses and further the profit-making capacity of the ruling class. Here again, we are compelled to interject revolutionary class politics into the mass struggle. Our work in this area has served to clarify a principled approach to the popular movement as contrasted with an opportunistic approach, as Lenin outlined in What Is to Be Done. Perhaps one of the most essential sections of Lenin's work, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, which we have studied in our regular Detroit Marxism classes, it encompasses chapters 3 and 4 of Imperialism. This book provides valuable insights into the character of exploitation on a grand scale. Lenin provides examples of the increasing concentration of industrial ownership during the 20th century and the eventual domination of manufacturing, real estate, and global trade by the banking sector. A century later, this phenomenon has become far more pronounced and evident. Consequently, in order to fight the exploitative system, we have no other choice than to focus our attention on finance capital. Lenin, in another important contribution entitled The State and Revolution, which was written months leading up to the Bolshevik seizure of power in 1917, discusses the political imperatives of state control by the proletariat. The capitalist state serves the interests of the monopolies and the financial institutions. A revolutionary organization and movement must take control of the state apparatus in order to build a social society paving the way towards communism. Lenin stresses that, quote, furthermore, during the transition from capitalism to communism, suppression is still necessary. But it is now the suppression of the exploiting minority by the exploited majority. A special apparatus, a special machine for suppression. The state is still necessary, But this is now a transitional state. It is no longer a state in the proper sense of the word. For the suppression of the minority of exploiters by the majority of the wage slaves of yesterday is comparatively so easy, simple and natural a task that it will entail far less bloodshed than the suppression of the rising slaves, serfs, or wage laborers. And it will cost mankind, or humanity, as we say today, far less. And it is compatible with the extension of democracy to such an overwhelming majority of the population that the need for a special machine of suppression will begin to disappear. Naturally, the exploiters are unable to suppress the people without a highly complex machine for performing this task. But the people can suppress the exploiters even with a simple machine, almost without a machine, without a special apparatus, by simple organization of the armed people, such as the Soviets of workers, soldiers, and deputies. In order to suppress the capitalists and the imperialists, we are tasked today with the building of a revolutionary organization of workers and the nationally oppressed. The masses of the people, through the selfless sacrifices of the Marxist-Leninist Party, guided by a scientific analysis of the objective conditions facing the exploited and the oppressed, tutored in its actual experience of propagandistic and programmatic work deriving from the needs and aspirations of the proletariat, the farmers, and the youth, this is the only hope for the transformation of human society. After the seizure of power by the Bolsheviks in October of 1917, and amid the protracted armed struggle to defeat the counter-revolutionaries, consisting of a coalition of imperialist countries which invaded the Soviet Union, the monarchists, the so-called socialist revolutionaries, and the Russian capitalists, Lenin reflected once again on the need to maintain the objectives of the Revolutionary Party. Even under the weight of the threatened reversal of the gains of the socialist revolution, Lenin maintains his view of what is necessary to eradicate all forms of exploitation and oppression. And I want to end with this quote from Lenin's book and his lecture entitled The State. In a lecture delivered at Verlov University on July 11th of 1919, Lenin observes, quote, "Whatever guise a republic may assume, however democratic it may be, if it is a bourgeois republic, if it retains private ownership of the land and the factories, and if private capital keeps the whole of society in wage slavery, that is, if the republic does not carry out what is proclaimed in the program of our party and in the Soviet Constitution, then this state is a machine for the suppression of some people by others. And we shall place this machine in the hands of the class is to overthrow the power of capital. We shall reject all the old prejudices about the state meaning universal equality. For that is a fraud, according to Lenin. As long as there is exploitation, there cannot be equality. The landowner cannot be the equal of the worker, or the hungry man or the hungry person the equal of the person who is full. This machine called the state, before which people bowed in superstitious awe, believing the old tales that it means popular rule, tales which the proletariat declares in awe, believing the old tales that it means popular rule, tales which the proletariat declares to be a bourgeois lie. This machine, the proletariat will smash. So far, we have deprived the capitalists of this machine and have taken it over. We shall use this machine or bludgeon to destroy all exploitation. And when the possibility of exploitation no longer exists anywhere in the world, when there are no longer owners of land and owners of factories, and when there is no longer a situation in which some gorge while others starve, only when the possibility of this no longer exists shall we consign this machine to the scrap heap. Then there will be no state and no exploitation. Such is the view of our Communist Party. I hope that we shall return to this subject in subsequent lectures, return to it again and again. Thank you so much for your attention. Let us build a workers' world. Let us emancipate the working class. Let us liberate the nationally oppressed. Let us organize the party. Thank you so much.